Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'll be moderating today's conversation about defining and defending a privacy budget for 2023. Our speakers today are Brandon Wiebe, Transcend's General Counsel and Head of Privacy, and Chris Shishido, Transcend's Finance Leader. People are still trickling in a little bit, so in the meantime, I want to point out the chat and the Q&A. Please feel encouraged to drop questions in there and we'll weave them into the conversation, time permitting, or if we run out of time, we'll be sure to follow up after the session ends. Gonna give it just a couple more seconds to let people trickle in. So it looks like we've got a good amount of people, and I'll go ahead and dive in. If you just joined us, welcome. My name is Morgan Sullivan, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. If you're new to Transcend, we're the platform that helps companies put privacy on autopilot, making it easy to encode privacy across an entire tech stack. Today, we're talking about how to get the privacy budget you need in 2023. And joining me are Brandon Wiebe, Transcend's General Counsel and Head of Privacy, and Chris Shishido, Transcend's Finance Leader. Brandon, Chris, I'll let you introduce yourselves.
Thanks, Morgan. Really excited to join everyone today. Super interesting topic that I think a lot of privacy practitioners struggle with. And in my past roles leading privacy organizations, something that I've noodled on a lot and tried to figure out. So excited to have this conversation today.
Thanks, Morgan. Chris Shishido here, part of the finance team at Transcend. Very excited to talk about budgeting since we're on end of year budget season right now and the coming year is upon us. So a very opportune time, and thanks for everyone for joining today.
So in terms of how we'll structure today, we'll start with the basics, top level advice that will set you up for success on your next budget request. Then we'll focus in on privacy, specifically how to position privacy as an asset rather than a cost center. And then we'll close out with what's really the meat of the conversation, which is how to rationalize your budget asks strictly in terms of the dollars and cents in order to make them really, really compelling. So Brandon, for someone just starting out, what top level advice would you give on how to get the budget you need?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'd probably point to like three more high level practical things to think about. And these are applicable not just in the privacy org, but really any org. But the first one is to learn your own organization's budgeting process really, really well and learn it early. Defining and advocating for a budget at any sized organization, but I think particularly at large organizations, can be a complex process with a lot of moving parts. So I think step one in any budgeting process is to understand what your own organization does and how they allocate dollars each year. So start really early to ask questions and get a sense of who owns those budgeting decisions. What will the process be? How do you get to submit a request, and who ends up making that final decision? And I think also understanding what the impact is of your team getting more budget. What I mean by that is oftentimes budgeting is a zero-sum game for organizations. So if you end up getting everything you ask for, what does that mean for other teams throughout your company, and what trade-offs are decision makers and management having to make? Because I think having that understanding is going to help you be a better advocate for your own resources and line items, because you can put yourself in your managers or your managers' head as they're thinking about these things company-wide. The second point I'd make is as you're beginning to define what your budget should be, you really should be backward planning. And what I mean by that is I think the process really begins by developing a strategic vision for your organization. So what is it that you want to accomplish, or what do you need to accomplish over the next year? How do those things align with your company's goals? you really need to ask yourself, like, what OKRs or projects or risk mitigation tasks have you completed a year from now? And only until you have that sort of strategic vision of like what the world looks like 12 months from now or 16 months from now, can you then begin to backward plan and go, okay, well, what resources will I actually need to accomplish these things? What headcount will I need? What software line items might I need? And from that context, you can begin to put together a much more well-articulated budget that ties to those goals. And then the third point that I'd make is to get decision makers on board as early as possible. If the first time that you're requesting a line item or a new resource is when you're actually submitting a budget proposal to your manager, you've probably waited too long. So as early as you can in the budgeting cycle, start thinking through what resources you'll need next year and develop that strategic vision, but then share that with your manager and get aligned on what that vision actually looks like. Because once you have that sort of strategic alignment, I think then it becomes much easier to show the decision makers in your organization what your privacy team looks like or what you haven't accomplished if you don't get the resources that you're asking for. And I think being able to articulate and show decision makers early on what your goals are, what the world looks like if you get what you're going to advocate for, it can go really far in terms of setting you up for success when it comes time to actually submit that budget request.
Yeah, it's a lot of great points. One of the phrases I hear come up in terms of budget a lot is ask early and ask often. Chris, from your perspective as a finance leader, in terms of strategy, what are some of the best practices when making budget requests?
Yeah, for this one, I always view the goal of framing a budget is to really put it in an ROI lens, and that just makes it easy for your finance team to digest and basically fit into the company level budget. So if I were, developing a privacy budget, for me, it would be all about quantifying actual cash savings and then quantifying potential increased revenue. So literally putting a dollar amount to it, and then it can be as simple as putting it on a slide or a proposal, and then passing that on to your finance team. Because from there, whether it's software spend, talent acquisition, or some type of new partnership, or potentially working with a contractor, it becomes so much more easy for that finance team to basically view it through their lens of payback on the budget request. So what I mean by payback is, a finance team will often look at what is the timeline to recoup either the initial cost for a certain budget line item or the ongoing annual costs of that particular line item as well. So there are tangible benefits and then intangible benefits associated with the line item. So ROI is really focusing on the tangible benefits. The intangibles really help the business as well, but they're going to be harder to basically convince your finance team upfront. But a smart finance team will assess those intangibles as well and really fit them into the strategic vision for the business. So I'll spend a little bit more time on the cash saving side and then also on the revenue generation side, because I think those are typically harder to do aside from, how does a particular line item strategically fit into the business. So if you're defining a privacy budget for the first time today, and you want to actually point out how much cash savings can my team save our business within 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, etc. You could start with, one scenario is if your team is manually processing your DSRs today, how many work hours and what's the compute cost savings that you could realize through automating the process. So this is what I view as basically prescribing a dollar amount to the cost of doing nothing or just running your business status quo. So could your company eliminate human processing error and then basically free up work hours from your eng and your security teams by partnering with an outside vendor? And if that turns out to be the case, that's a very good thing. Then you can pass that knowledge on to your finance team and show them that the timeline to break even for a specific budget request is very real and very near term, rather than like 4 or 5 years out. And if you want to take this, even a step further, you could assess. We could either partner with an outside vendor, or we could build that type of solution in-house for processing DSRs. And if you want to discuss that situation with your finance team, I'm sure they would be very happy to assess basically what is the benefit of potentially going to an outsourced vendor or in-house. And then you could basically put your heads together and come up with the best solution. So that's on the cost side. And then on the revenue side, this is going to be a little bit more difficult depending on your company's background and what industry it operates in. But if at all possible, it's really advantageous to basically tie your privacy initiatives to direct revenue growth. So this topic is going to require input from typically a lot of teams at your organization. So similar to what Brandon mentioned, you do want to build cross-functional alignment pretty early on. So one example I can give you is if you are looking to partner with, say, your marketing team and assess whether increased customer trust through your privacy initiatives, and what that really translates to is basically better data privacy controls. Could that drive greater prospect conversion? And if it can, then you basically have something that ties directly to revenue generation and is so much more justifiable. And then another scenario is if you are more advanced along in your privacy budget process, and this isn't your first time setting one up, and this year you're looking to partner with your sales team, you're looking at your 2023 forecast, and you're trying to assess, can we actually segment our customer base and identify a specific sub-segment that would really like our product more or like our offering more if we had a higher standard of privacy. So you could break it out by sub-vertical and whatnot, but essentially what you're doing is allowing your company to say, can we compete up market or in a new segment by investing in privacy? And if you frame it that way, the conversation becomes a lot more fluid and easy. So in summary, all those points point back to really one topic or one concept, and it's ROI. And I believe that really is the gating decision for a lot of finance teams. So if you're able to tie dollar amounts to your budget, that's going to help you immensely.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and definitely sets us up really well for our next question, which is, what I'm hearing and what I think a lot of people know to be the truth is that the crux of the privacy budget question is the need to position privacy as an asset rather than a cost center. So Brandon, what do you think is the best way for privacy professionals to do that?
Yeah, I do think that this gets at the crux of the question, and I think Chris had a lot of great insight on how to articulate privacy as an ROI asset. So I'm going to probably echo a lot of his thoughts on this. But as you're developing your strategic vision for your privacy org, you really should be tying that vision into your company's values, your overarching company vision and goals. I think as privacy professionals, we tend to think a lot in terms of risk and harm mitigation, but those types of things don't typically make it into a company's goals for the year. Most organizations, don't have an OKR of getting sued less, for example. But for any risk mitigation activity, and I think Chris articulated this well, there's usually a corresponding opportunity that you can describe. So for example, does your company have a broad initiative related to customer experience and trust and success? And as Chris mentioned, that could be directly tied to customer conversions. So in the B2C context, that trust relationship is imperative to building a strong brand. Or could you improve customer satisfaction through a better privacy experience? Initiatives like eliminating dark patterns, clarifying your privacy notice, making opt-outs and privacy requests more accessible. Like we know as privacy practitioners, these are all regulatory requirements, and we can go, to CCPA and point to exactly where they are. But they also have a hugely positive impact on customer experience and customer success, and ultimately, conversion and retention of customers. So if you're able to draw that privacy work directly to that customer benefit, I think that's going to be really valuable. Another example in like the B2B context is to look at how many times customers asked about your company privacy practices during a deal cycle, or how many times did a customer want to negotiate a DPA? Are you running up against customers that are uncomfortable signing up for your service because you can't agree that you will delete all their data on termination or something like that? Well, that we can characterize that on the privacy side as a regulatory risk under GDPR and CCPA, because we know as processors, we have an obligation to delete their data. But we can also very clearly articulate that as costing the company actual revenue and actual deals. And so I think making that tie-in will go a long way in terms of advocating for your budget. I think the other point I'd make is there are ways to identify privacy initiatives as cost reduction measures for the business. So Chris mentioned some around process improvements, automation, and efficiency. Another one I might flag is where is imprecise collection or over collection or use of data costing your business? So oftentimes data minimization processes, which are projects which are key to a lot of early privacy programs, fit really well with company projects to improve margins, reduce hosting costs, eliminate tech debt. And so I bet if you start to look at some of the work that your engineering team may be doing or your security team may be doing, there's going to be a lot of overlap between some of the privacy initiatives you may have and some of the cost reduction goals that other parts of your business have. And then the last thing that I'll add here is that I still think it's totally fine to use fear of regulatory penalties and enforcement actions as a stick to advocate for resources. But if you do go down that route, you're going to need to spend some time educating finance and other budget decision makers on what those risks actually are. That requires some work on figuring out how to quantify those risks. Companies have lots of different approaches for doing this. What I've found in past roles is that a simple method of scoring risks is, maybe you go through and you've done a privacy gap analysis and you have this long list of things you're out of compliance for. For each one of those, you can score them on the likelihood that that risk will have some sort of impact on your business. You could do like a 1 through 4 rating of likelihood to occur. And then you multiply that by the scope of impact if that risk did occur. And so you can use that sort of back of the napkin formula to begin to put together a sense of what risks the company is carrying on an ongoing basis, and then tie those into, well, how is your privacy budget going to actually reduce those risks long term? So those are just a few ways that you can begin to position the privacy program as an actual asset to the company.
That makes a lot of sense, and really liked your first point. I run the XFN newsletter here at Transcend, and today one of the stories I added was about a Cisco survey that indicated that, I'm not going to try to quote exact numbers here, but that a significant proportion of respondents, if they felt a brand was mishandling their data or would mishandle their data, felt increased distrust and would even consider switching to a brand who they felt their data was safer with. So I think that's really relevant and only going to become more so as time moves on. But Brandon, we've done a lot of panel prep for industry panels, and in a lot of those conversations, the idea of building relationships across the org to advocate for your own initiatives has come up a lot. And I'm wondering, in your experience, does that same idea apply to advocating for new line items?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it really starts with building those relationships by learning what other teams are working on and what goals other teams have over the coming, 12, 24 months, whatever it is. For example, we talked a little bit about this, but does your marketing team have a project around customer experience and improving that, or building a stronger trust brand? If they do, you may have a shared goal with them. Another one that I've seen come up is the go-to-market team has a goal over the next year of targeting more heavily regulated businesses as potential customers. Well, if that's one of their goals, then privacy is almost certainly going to be at the center of many of those new deals. Like we just talked about earlier, are there cost reduction or operation programs or projects that other teams have in place? And if so, there may be overlap with a data mapping or a data minimization project that you may have on the privacy side. So I think it's about building relationships, but then also understanding where there may be mutual goals between you and these cross-functional teams. I think kind of the second step of that process on the budgeting side and for advocating for new line items is, once you've identified that overlap, are there common areas that these teams could accomplish together? So if the security team has a project of like evaluating your risk exposure in terms of what sensitive data you're storing, you could probably work with them on a data mapping exercise and accomplish your goal and their goal together, and share that budget. Or even fully co-opt their budget. Another example, if you identified a common project, is could you borrow an engineer from your engineering team to assist you with a technical privacy implementation? So I do think that once you've identified kind of where that Venn diagram is between you and other teams, then you can start to think strategically about, well, how can I leverage other folks' budget? And sometimes teams that are budgeted a little bit more generously than privacy to still accomplish my goals over the next year.
So I think building those relationships is what I would consider maybe the soft skills of budget advocacy, but obviously we can't forget the power of hard data. Hard data and numbers are critical to making a compelling case. So Brandon, what metrics do you recommend privacy professionals focus on?
Yeah, so there's probably a ton. I'll highlight a few that jump to mind for me. So in terms of how the privacy program can drive revenue, particularly in the B2B context, which is my background, tracking things like the number of DPAs negotiated, or the number of privacy inquiries from prospects that ended up leading to a closed won deal, can be really valuable. And I would say not just like the number of deals that got closed, or that were a number of DPAs that got negotiated, but also looking at like what were the value of those deals in terms of revenue for the company. And that's one way to directly tie the impact that your privacy team has had on the company's bottom line. The other thing to look at here is also, did you lose any customers or not close any deals because of a privacy issue? Did you get into a conversation with a potential customer and they decided to go with a competitor because they just were not comfortable from a privacy perspective with your organization? Well, if you can quantify that, then that's a really good argument for why allocating resources to your privacy organization can help drive revenue for your business. I think the other area of metrics to look at are what are your current resource draws, and how can process improvements and your requested budget drive efficiencies, not just on your team, but across the business overall. And Chris touched on this earlier, but some things to track would be the number of audits that you get, privacy audits, third-party audits, or customer audits, the number of privacy impact assessments you have to perform. And then a big one for a lot of organizations is the number of DSARs that you have to process. And for each of these, how much time is that taking for your team, but also for other teams that have to service these things? So for example, is your customer success team fielding DSARs manually? And what's the time impact of that for them as they're processing these things? And if your strategic vision for your privacy program and the budget that you're requesting includes process improvements or automation that will help free up time, well, you can very easily articulate what the cost savings for the organization are going to be. And then the last one that we already mentioned was developing some metrics and a baseline on tracking your privacy risks. So if you are able to adopt a formula of tracking risks and then stack ranking those risks based off of likelihood of occurrence and the size of downside, I would say that's not just like a snapshot in time project that you should do, but it should be something that you're tracking long-term over time, so that when you get to the end of next year, you can show and demonstrate how the budget that you were allocated actually led to risk reduction, and that risk matrix got shorter because of the work that the privacy program did.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, privacy is a fairly nascent industry. So finding these metrics, or a lot of these metrics maybe haven't been established for a lot of people, but I think as much work as you can do to go out and find them is going to pay huge dividends, in next year's budget and the budget after that. I think it really can't be understated, the importance of finding good metrics. And Chris, we haven't forgotten about you as a finance leader. Obviously your day-to-day revolves around the bottom line. How would you rationalize a budget strictly in terms of the dollars?
Thanks, Morgan. Before I get to that question, the topic of KPI tracking and adding this to a finance dashboard, or from a finance view, being able to track security metrics is amazing. So thanks for pointing that out, Brandon. And I think it should be incorporated into every board deck going forward, and is essentially just as important in my view as the numbers of a business. So to answer your question, Morgan, about defining a budget, in terms of dollars, the way at least I personally view it is that I look at a budget request, if it were to come into my team through an income statement lens, and I just use that as a proxy for the total business. And income statements flow from revenue down to net income, which is basically the bottom line. But the way I like to do it is actually in the reverse order for a privacy budget. And the reason why is because for a privacy budget, if you start with the bottom line, which is basically downside aversion. So if you focus your initial thinking, which I believe should be the easiest to do, on costs that flow straight to your bottom line, and then from there build upwards, your rationale for your budget becomes much more justifiable and defensible if your finance team were to ever dig in and ask you a bunch of questions about what exactly is in the privacy budget. So I'll start with downside aversion. Essentially what this is what is the penalty for non-compliance? So if you operate in a specific industry, in a specific geography, and there are rules and regulations involved, what is the fines and penalties you'd pay for lack of compliance? So this is the starting point, and it's basically, it's table stakes, because it would essentially be a build upon what Brandon mentioned earlier. The fine amount by assessing what's the risk that basically you would be not in compliance, and then multiply that by what your expected fine would be. And from there, that number oftentimes is going to be so large, it can actually be multiples of your annual privacy budget alone. So starting from there is pretty easy. And then you can start building up to, other scenarios. So like as an example, you could talk to your security team and assess what's the cost of a data breach, including the impact to your brand. The security team is probably already going to be assessing that, but you can actually include that in your privacy budget because they really do go hand in hand. And you can also include, what's the upside we could realize if we could identify and respond to a security incident super quickly. And then finally, in the more practical arena, insurance premiums. So can you actually realize better insurance premiums if you were to increase your privacy controls or basically create a privacy framework from scratch for the very first time? So these are all practical foundational questions, and they really do, in my opinion, establish a baseline floor for your privacy budget. So worst case scenario, you could add these all up and say, here's why my privacy budget is justifiable. And then from there, you can start working your way up from the bottom line to operational items. So think about your company's budget and then pinpoint line items in your company's budget where your privacy initiatives can actually alleviate costs. So the way I like to think about this is functional day-to-day improvements, and typically they involve humans and your coworkers and your colleagues, and then also hosting costs. So in terms of working with your teammates, it's really about how many hours of manual processing or how many hours of engineering and security work hours can you save, and how many hours of monitoring work can you also save. And then in terms of scoping that out, one example would be if your team is embarking upon data mapping for the first time, and basically that you have a bunch of data that sits in disparate silos, you want to boil it up to the company level to make it accessible and clean. But what you can do is basically tally all those hours together, work with your finance team, assign a dollar per hour cost that you would basically have to input to solve the problem, and then use that as a benchmark for payback. And that is going to depend, whether you use internal labor or outsourced labor. But ultimately, the argument is pretty compelling there because the gains that can be realized, since privacy is really in the early innings here, are pretty material for most companies. And then, as we pointed out earlier, data footprints and reducing your hosting and compute costs, this is a huge area as well. So you can either work with your IT or security teams and apply that to a gross margin forecast. And depending on the size of your company, if you're a larger publicly traded firm, this is going to be huge. And this could easily, again, similar to penalties, be multiples of an annual privacy budget. If you're a smaller company, this is basically investing in your future and can help out as well. But for a big company, this can be a material point. And then the last area I look to is actually what I think is one of the most important ones. It's what is the potential revenue growth impact that investing in privacy can drive for your company. A finance team may be skeptical about this, but if you partner with other orgs at your firm, you may uncover some really great nuggets of information. So I basically touched on this earlier, but if you work with your sales and marketing team and try to assess what type of product or service you're selling and how can privacy generate greater conversion or greater sales, if you make a pretty conservative forecast, which would be great for your finance team, they obviously don't want you to go and project all blue sky scenarios. That will help them frame the privacy budget in context of the company level budget. So if your privacy budget is totally justifiable from a bottom line and gross margin perspective, the increased potential revenue generation is basically icing on the cake. And that makes it so much easier to digest and pass through.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, speaking from personal experience, and I think anyone who's worked in tech long enough knows that if you can attach the label revenue generating to something that you're doing, then that's gold. But Chris, if you had to summarize, what arguments do you, as a finance executive, what arguments do you find most compelling when it comes to adding a new line item?
Yeah, the number one argument I find compelling is, does a privacy budget, whether it's established for the first time or it's ongoing and it's expanding, does that actually help us, or at least us as Transcend, does it help us as a company progress towards our purpose and vision? And the reason why is because the revenue generation potential is going to be there, but multiple stakeholders in the business can have varying views on whether or not that can be realized. Obviously, if you're, from the point of view from someone developing the privacy budget, it would be great if we could realize, those revenue streams in a 6-month or 1-year timeframe. That may not always be the case, but the number one area for me is, does it align with our purpose and vision? And will our customers support us even more? Or would they potentially not buy our product if we did not invest in protecting their privacy? So that's number one. And the reason why I feel that's actually a superior argument than cost savings and efficiency gains is that, at least from my view, there's always room in any company's budget to basically pay for compliance. The last thing a finance team wants to do is deny a security team the ability to buy security software and then receive some type of fine or penalty. So I think defending your brand in that way is pretty much table stakes for a finance and operations team. And then the same goes for unlocking operational efficiencies. So saving your engine security team's work hours, that really can pay for itself. And it's a mathematical exercise that can be computed, and your finance team can basically make that decision with pretty high conviction. And then you can slap a timeline onto it and get to a reasonable result. But it's really purpose and vision. That's where, finance teams and any execs at a company need to make a judgment call. So in summary, purpose and vision plus revenue, these are harder to quantify, but they ultimately, can have greater impact on the long-term trajectory of your company. And then cost savings and operational efficiencies are more immediate gains, and they're more easily quantifiable. But I do think the first two outweigh the latter in the long run.
And Brandon, we've got a couple more minutes left. Any closing thoughts?
Well, first of all, appreciate all of Chris's thoughts on this, and I will be integrating all of them into my own budget request shortly. No, the final thought I'd add is that I think we as privacy practitioners can get really focused on the specific regulatory requirements and the technical work streams that are needed to meet those requirements. Privacy practitioners are very detail-oriented folks, and that's really important for us in our day-to-day tactical work. But if we talk about privacy to our cross-functional colleagues purely in terms of regulatory requirements, I think folks find it difficult to contextualize the work that we do within the broader goals of the business. I think when we talk about privacy more in the context of things like individual rights and customer trust and how that drives revenue and helps us meet our business goals, folks understand that a little bit more implicitly. And I think individuals actually get privacy pretty quickly when they talk about it in terms of their own lives and the impact that privacy has on themselves as individuals. So I think the more that we can do to tie our goals as a privacy organization to these broader values and goals that our company may have, the more effective we're going to be at positioning privacy as a truly indispensable asset to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great points. We've actually got 5 minutes left and do have a question. So let's see. How would you advise a company that has a reactive rather than a proactive management mindset? Such a company doesn't see a privacy budget as giving value or as an asset, but just adding cost that could have been used for operations or to grow the company. Of course, when something does happen, it's easier to sell such a company, but at that point, it's a costly lesson. Any input on how to deal with a reactive mindset and try to move them towards a proactive mindset?
I'll take this one, and then if you have any data points to add. From a just positioning perspective, outside of all of the stories and articles about fines companies have received, which are pretty compelling in my view. But if you don't read those, and if you're just looking internally within the business, I would say for teams that are not proactive, embarking down the revenue generation potential for privacy software or services, or privacy team in general, may be a little difficult. So if there are actual operational efficiencies to be gained, for example, pointing out literal work hours or time saved, that may be the best bet. Alternatively, one could simply aggregate, basically all of the downside risk and point that out to a company. But if management doesn't believe that the risk is real, it may be an uphill battle to convince them that that's the case. So it really is, in my mind, pointing out efficiency gains and cost savings. That really may be the only way for a non-proactive company.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And we actually have another question. How can policy side professionals emphasize the value of budgeting for privacy for industry side folks trying to make these cases?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that one. Certainly on the policy side, it can be trickier to develop a clear tie-in between the work that policy folks are doing at a business and how that either reduces cost or generates revenue, or how we can quantify the value there. I do think the process is the same in my mind, at least, which is starting with a broad strategic vision for what your organization wants to accomplish and how that aligns with company values and company goals. Because I think once you've gone through that exercise and are able to identify at a high level how your organization is driving those company goals, you are going to be in a much better position to articulate how the specific resources you need to meet your own organization's your own team's goals are going to push the business forward. So I think in my mind, starting at a high level and getting that sort of top level company alignment on your your next 12 months and what that looks like and how it's going to drive the business forward will naturally lead into a much more compelling budget case when it's time to put that budget together.
All right, so we actually have 1 minute and one more question, so I'm going to try to squeeze it in. Thoughts on how to position a privacy program for a manufacturer that is principally a data controller rather than a processor? Seems like revenue generation is easier to tie in for data processors or service providers.
Yeah, I think that can be true. I appreciate the question. I guess I would want to look at the specific business and see, what data they are processing and where they are a controller. Oftentimes the types of data that you end up processing as a controller in this sort of B2B context, where there's not the service provider relationship necessarily, is you're processing the data about your customers' employees, right? So it's B2B prospect information or customer information. And I think there's still a case to be made for building a trust brand in that context. So I do think there can be some value there to pursuing that, but I think it probably depends on what the scope of data is that you're actually processing and what your own data map and topography looks like.
So we're actually right on time and I don't see any other questions. So thank you, Chris. Thank you, Brandon, for your fantastic insight today. And thank you everyone for joining the session. If you do have a question later on, please feel free to reach out directly. And either way, we'll be sending out a recording of this session, I think later today or tomorrow. But thank you all again and have a great day.
Thanks.
Thank you, Morgan. Thanks, Chris.
Morgan. Thanks, Brandon.
Have a good one. Bye.